In the winter of 1945, as Allied forces pushed deeper into enemy territory, they encountered countless abandoned fortifications, silent monuments to a war that had consumed the world. But one bunker, hidden deep in the frost-covered forests of the Eastern Front, would become the subject of whispered legends among soldiers. Veterans spoke of it in hushed tones decades later, their eyes distant with memories they couldn't fully explain. They heard screams, agonizing, desperate screams, emanating from a structure that had been sealed shut for months. When they finally breached the reinforced door, expecting to find survivors or prisoners, they discovered something far more disturbing: absolute emptiness. No bodies, no signs of recent habitation, nothing that could explain the sounds that had tormented them for days. This is the story of the Screaming Bunker, a tale that sits at the uncomfortable intersection of documented military history and the inexplicable, where the wounds of war cut deeper than flesh and bone, leaving scars on reality itself. The 3rd Battalion had been advancing through the Hurtgen Forest region for 3 weeks when Sergeant Michael Kovacs first reported hearing the sounds. It was February 1945, and the brutal winter had turned the already treacherous forest into a frozen hell. Snow crunched beneath their boots as they moved cautiously through the skeletal remains of trees shattered by artillery fire. The men were exhausted, jumpy from constant skirmishes with retreating enemy forces who fought with the desperation of cornered animals. Kovacs was a veteran of the North African campaign, a steady man not given to flights of fancy. When he called for Lieutenant James Harrison to join him at the edge of a small clearing, there was no fear in his voice, only confusion. "Sir, you need to hear this," he said, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Harrison trudged through the snow to where Kovacs stood near what appeared to be a bunker entrance, half buried by winter's assault and covered with camouflage netting that had partially collapsed under the weight of ice. At first, Harrison heard nothing but the wind whistling through the broken forest. Then it came, a sound so out of place that it made his stomach tighten. Screaming, not the sharp crack of a soldier's dying cry in battle, but prolonged, agonized wailing that seemed to rise and fall like a terrible tide. It was muffled, as if coming from deep underground, but unmistakably human. Multiple voices, he realized, overlapping in a chorus of suffering that made the hair on his neck stand up despite the cold. "How long has this been going on?" Harrison asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Kovacs shook his head. "Started about an hour ago, sir. Comes and goes. Sometimes it stops for 10-15 minutes, then starts up again." The lieutenant pulled out his field binoculars and examined the bunker entrance more carefully. The steel door was sealed, rust and ice forming along its edges. More troubling was the official Wehrmacht marking that had been spray-painted across it in faded white. Versicled Nicht öffnen, sealed, do not open. Harrison assembled a squad to investigate. 7 men, including Kovacs, approached the bunker with weapons ready. The screaming had stopped again, leaving only an oppressive silence that somehow felt worse. Private Danny O'Brien, the youngest of the group, whispered that maybe they should leave it alone, but his suggestion was ignored. This was enemy territory. Any structure could house holdouts, wounded soldiers, or worse, intelligence materials that command would want recovered. As they got closer, everyone could hear it now. The walls of the bunker seemed to pulse with the muffled sounds of human agony. Corporal James Fletcher, a demolitions expert, examined the door. "This wasn't sealed from the outside, Lieutenant," he reported. "Look at these bolt mechanisms. They're engaged from the interior. Someone locked themselves in." That detail would haunt Harrison for years. Why would anyone seal themselves inside a concrete tomb? And if they were trapped inside screaming for help, why hadn't they tried to break out? The battalion commander, Major Robert Thornton, arrived within the hour after Harrison radioed back to headquarters. Thornton was a by-the-book officer who'd seen action since D-Day. He listened to the sounds emanating from the sealed structure with a deepening frown. "We open it," he finally decided. "Could be prisoners, could be booby-trapped, could be nothing. But we can't leave without knowing." As Fletcher began preparing explosive charges to breach the door, the screaming inside grew louder, more frantic, as if whoever, or whatever, was inside knew what was about to happen. Fletcher worked methodically despite the unnerving soundtrack of screams that continued to pulse from within the bunker. He packed shaped charges around the hinges and locking mechanism, making sure to use just enough explosive to breach the door without causing structural collapse. "Stand back about 50 meters, he ordered. "This thing's built like a fortress. There's going to be debris." The men retreated to positions behind trees and fallen logs, weapons trained on the entrance. The explosion cracked through the forest with sharp percussion that sent snow cascading from nearby branches. When the smoke cleared, the door hung askew on its mangled hinges, revealing a gaping darkness beyond. The screaming had stopped. The sudden silence was total and absolute, as if a switch had been thrown. Lieutenant Harrison felt his mouth go dry. That immediate cessation of sound wasn't natural. It was too abrupt, too complete. "Fletcher, O'Brien, Kovacs, with me," Harrison ordered. "The rest of you, maintain perimeter. Shoot anything that comes out that isn't us." The 4 men approached the entrance with flashlights mounted on their rifles, beams cutting through the settling dust. The darkness inside seemed almost solid, swallowing their lights like water absorbing drops of ink. Harrison stepped through first, his boots crunching on debris from the blast. The bunker's interior was larger than expected. The entrance tunnel sloped downward at a gentle angle, concrete walls showing signs of hasty construction. The Germans had built this quickly, probably during their initial push eastward years ago. Water had seeped in from somewhere, creating frozen puddles that reflected their flashlight beams in eerie patterns. The air was heavy with the smell of mold, rust, and something else, something organic and rotten that made O'Brien gag behind his scarf. They moved slowly, checking corners and alcoves, but found nothing. No enemy soldiers, no prisoners, no bodies. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber that had clearly served as a command post. Broken furniture lay scattered about, a desk overturned, chairs with legs snapped off, filing cabinets tipped on their sides with papers spilling out. Maps on the walls showed defensive positions that were now months out of date. A radio set sat in the corner, its tubes shattered, wires pulled loose like the guts of a mechanical corpse. "Where the hell are they?" Kovacs muttered, his voice echoing strangely in confined space. The walls seemed to drink up sound, deadening it in an unnatural way. Fletcher was examining the interior of the door. "Lieutenant, look at this," he called. Harrison joined him and saw what caught the corporal's attention. The locking mechanism on the inside had been engaged, just as Fletcher had suspected from the outside. But there was more. Long scratch marks scored the metal around the bolts, deep gouges that could only have been made by frantic hands clawing at the steel. More disturbing were the rust-brown stains around the scratches. Blood. Someone had torn their fingernails off, trying to undo the locks they themselves had engaged. Harrison's mind struggled to make sense of it. "Spread out," he ordered. "Search every room. There has to be an explanation." The bunker complex was larger than they'd initially realized. Several smaller rooms branched off from the main chamber. Sleeping quarters, a supply room, what looked like a medical station. All were empty. All showed signs of hasty abandonment or violent departure. In the medical room, O'Brien found something that made him call out. Restraint straps hung from an examination table, torn and frayed as if whoever had been bound there had thrashed with superhuman strength. Medical instruments lay scattered on the floor, scalpels, syringes, forceps, along with shattered glass vials. The labels were in German, but one word was repeated on several containers. Versuchsperson. Test subject. As the team pushed deeper into the bunker complex, the architecture became increasingly strange. The initial chambers had been purely functional, standard military construction with right angles and uniform dimensions. But the deeper sections showed different characteristics, as if built during different phases or for different purposes. The walls here were rougher, more hastily constructed, and they curved in ways that made spatial perception difficult. Corridors seemed to extend longer than they should have, given the bunker's exterior dimensions. Kovacs paused at a junction where 3 corridors met. "Anyone else feel like we've been walking downhill this whole time?" he asked. Harrison checked his compass and frowned. The needle was spinning slowly, unable to find magnetic north. He shook it, tapped the glass, but the erratic behavior continued. "Equipment malfunction," he muttered, but he didn't sound convinced. Fletcher had produced a piece of chalk and was marking their path on the walls. creating arrows to guide them back to the entrance. The sleeping quarters they found were the most unsettling. 12 bunks lined the walls of a long, narrow room. Every mattress had been shredded, stuffing pulled out and scattered across the floor like snow. The metal bed frames were twisted and bent, some completely pulled away from the wall mounts. In the dim flashlight beams, Harrison could see more scratch marks on the walls, hundreds of them, overlapping in manic patterns. Some formed recognizable shapes. Crosses, circles, and what might have been words in German script, though too frantic and distorted to read clearly. O'Brien discovered a journal wedged behind one of the destroyed bunks. The leather cover was water-stained and mildewed, but the pages inside were still legible. Most entries were mundane: supply inventories, duty rosters, complaints about the cold. But the final entries, dated November 1944, took on a different tone. Harrison read them aloud by flashlight. The experiments continued despite protests from medical staff. The test subjects are becoming increasingly agitated. Dr. Reinhardt claims the side effects are temporary, but I have my doubts. The next entry was dated 3 days later. 2 orderlies refuse to enter the containment area today. They claim they hear voices when they approach. Colonel Hoffman had them arrested for cowardice. Morale is collapsing. Even Hoffman looks afraid now. The final entry was barely legible, the handwriting deteriorating into a desperate scrawl. They're in the walls. We can hear them in the walls. We've sealed the main door, but I don't think it matters. God forgive us for what we've done here. God forgive. The text ended mid-sentence. Fletcher found something in the supply room that added another layer to the mystery. Chemical containers, dozens of them, all empty but bearing hazard symbols and German pharmaceutical company labels. He photographed several with his Kodak field camera, standard issue for intelligence gathering. This wasn't just a defensive position, he said. This was some kind of research facility. The medical station yielded more disturbing evidence. Filing cabinets full of documentation bearing the letterhead of the SS Medical Corps detailed records of experiments that made Harrison's blood run cold even in the already freezing bunker. Test subjects numbered 001 through 047, all listed with dates of acquisition and sparse personal details. Most were identified only as Ostarbeiter, Eastern laborers, the Nazi euphemism for Soviet prisoners. The documented procedures were horrific. Sensory deprivation, experimental pharmaceuticals, psychological torture designed to induce specific mental states. The scientific language couldn't disguise the brutality. The final reports for most subjects included a date of termination and the notation, dispose of according to protocol. But subjects 042 through 047 had different endings to their records. Instead of termination dates, their files simply noted, containment failure, subject status unknown, recommend immediate facility evacuation, and seal. Those entries were dated November 18, 1944, exactly 3 months before the American battalion arrived. The question that haunted Harrison as he read through the files was simple but terrifying. If the test subject had been contained in a facility evacuated and sealed 3 months ago, who had been screaming? The team had been inside the bunker for over an hour when Private O'Brien announced he needed to relieve himself. Harrison nodded toward a corner of the supply room they'd been searching. Make it quick. We're pulling out in 5 minutes. O'Brien stepped away into the shadows beyond the reach of their flashlights, grateful for a moment of privacy despite the oppressive atmosphere. That's when he heard it, a whisper, soft and urgent, speaking in accented English. Help me. Please help me. O'Brien froze, his hands trembling as he fumbled with his uniform. Hello? He called out, his voice cracking. The others turned toward him, flashlight beams swinging across the darkness. What is it? Harrison demanded. I heard someone, O'Brien insisted. A voice, speaking English, said they needed help. The men exchanged glances. Kovacs moved to sweep the core with his flashlight, but there was nothing there, just concrete walls, empty shells, and shadows. You're hearing things, Fletcher said, but his voice lacked conviction. This place is getting to all of us. We need to get out. But as they turned to leave, they all heard it. Not a single whisper, but a chorus of voices, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Some spoke German, others Russian, a few in what might have been Polish. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, afraid. Harrison tried to pinpoint the source, but it was impossible. The voices seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the darkness beyond their lights, from the very air around them. "Kovacs!" Radio Major Thornton, Harrison ordered, fighting to keep the tremor out of his voice. "Tell him we've encountered something unusual and are evacuating immediately." But when Kovacs pulled out the field radio, it produced only static, harsh, crackling interference that hurt their ears. They moved quickly back toward the entrance, following Fletcher's chalk marks. But something was wrong. The corridor they'd come through seemed different. Longer, the angle of descent steeper. "Are we going the right way?" O'Brien asked, panic creeping into his voice. Fletcher pointed to his chalk arrows on the wall, following the marks exactly, but he didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. They were all thinking it. The bunker was changing around them, or they were somehow disoriented despite the clearly marked path. The voices grew louder, more insistent. Harrison could now make out specific words in the German phrases. Hilf, help. Dunkelheit, darkness. Verloren, lost. The Russian words he couldn't understand, but the anguish in the tones needed no translation. A new sound joined the chorus. Footsteps, dozens of them, echoing through unseen corridors. Running footsteps, getting closer. Double time. Harrison shouted, and they broke into a run. Their flashlights bounced wildly, throwing shadows that seemed to move with malevolent purpose. O'Brien swore he saw figures in the peripheral darkness. Pale, gaunt shapes that matched their pace. "Don't look at them," he screamed. "Don't look." Fletcher reached the junction they'd marked earlier, but instead of the three-way split they remembered, for corridors now branched off in different directions. "This isn't possible," Fletcher breathed, but Harrison was already making a decision. "There." He pointed to the leftmost corridor where a faint gray light filtered down, daylight from the entrance. They ran toward it, the voices now screaming behind them, the sound of pursuing footsteps like a stampede. The temperature had dropped further, their breath creating dense fog that their flashlights struggled to penetrate. Ice was forming on the walls, spreading in unnatural patterns that resembled reaching hands. They burst from the bunker entrance into the snow and daylight, gasping, stumbling, falling to their knees. The soldiers who remained outside rushed to help them, asking what had happened, but none of the four could speak at first. When Harrison finally looked back at the bunker entrance, the darkness inside was absolute, swallowing all light that tried to enter. And from that darkness, faint but unmistakable, came the sound they first heard hours ago, screaming. Major Thornton stood outside the bunker entrance, listening to Lieutenant Harrison's report with an expression that grew darker with each detail. The younger officer was trying to maintain composure, but his hands shook as he consulted his notes. The other three men who'd been inside sat nearby, wrapped in blankets, drinking coffee that medics had provided. None of them could stop glancing back at the bunker, as if expecting something to emerge. "Let me understand this correctly," Thornton said slowly. "You're telling me that an abandoned German bunker, which has been sealed for months, contained no people, but you heard multiple voices speaking different languages, that the interior dimension seemed to change, and that you all experienced some kind of mass hallucination involving ghostly figures chasing you out." His tone made it clear what he thought of the story. Harrison met his superior's eyes. "With respect, sir, I'm telling you exactly what happened. I have a journal from one of the German personnel that documents experiments on prisoners. I have photographic evidence of chemical containers and medical equipment. And I have 4 trained soldiers who all experienced the same phenomena. This wasn't hallucination. It was real." Thornton took the water-stained journal and flipped through it, his frown deepening. The photographs Fletcher had taken showed the containers and equipment clearly enough. Chemical weapons research, Thornton concluded. The Germans probably exposed prisoners to some kind of nerve agent or hallucinogenic compound. There could be residual contamination in the air down there that would explain the auditory hallucinations and the disorientation you experience. It was a rational explanation, one that fit the evidence without requiring belief in anything supernatural. Harrison wanted to accept it, wanted the comfortable certainty of a scientific answer. But he couldn't shake the memory of those voices, the impossible layout corridors, the sense of malevolent intelligence guiding whatever had happened in that bunker. "Sir, I respectfully request that we seal this facility permanently and mark it as contaminated. No one else should go inside." Thornton nodded. "Already planned on it, Lieutenant. This is exactly the kind of thing intelligence will want to know about. We'll have a chemical warfare team come through once the area is fully secured." As they spoke, Corporal Fletcher was taking photographs of the bunker exterior for the official report. Through his viewfinder, he noticed something odd. The entrance appeared different than it had that morning. The shadows around it seemed deeper, more extensive. He adjusted his focus, trying to get a clear shot, and that's when he saw it. Just inside the entrance, barely visible in the darkness, stood a figure, pale, emaciated, wearing what looked like tattered prisoner clothing. Fletcher lowered the camera, his heart hammering. The figure was gone. He raised the camera again and looked through the viewfinder. There it was, still standing just inside the entrance, now joined by others. 7, 8, maybe more figures, all staring out from the darkness. "Sir," Fletcher called out, his voice cracking. "There's someone in there." The men scrambled for weapons, forming up in defensive positions around the entrance. Thornton grabbed Fletcher's binoculars and studied the bunker entrance. "I don't see anything, Corporal." "Where exactly?" Fletcher pointed. But even as he did, he realized the figures were gone. The entrance showed only darkness, empty and still. "They were there, sir. I saw them through my camera." Thornton studied the young corporal for a long moment. "You've been through a traumatic experience. Soldier. Your mind is playing tricks. It happens." But Fletcher wasn't convinced, and neither was anyone else who'd been inside. As the battalion prepared to move out, leaving the bunker behind, Fletcher developed his film in a makeshift darkroom he'd set up in a captured German farmhouse. When the prints were ready and he examined them with a magnifying glass, his blood turned to ice. There, in the photograph of the bunker entrance, barely visible but definitely present, were the figures, 7 pale shapes standing just inside the darkness, their faces blurred but their postures radiating suffering and rage. And there was one more detail he noticed, one that made him burn the photograph rather than submit it with his official report. The figures weren't standing on the ground. They were floating, hovering just inches above the bunker floor, defying every law of physics and reason. 2 weeks after the battalion moved on from the screaming bunker, U.S. Army intelligence finally arrived to investigate. Captain Richard Aldrich led a team of 5 specialists, 2 chemical warfare experts, a military psychologist, a German translator, and a combat photographer. They'd been briefed on the initial report, which Aldrich privately considered to be exaggerated combat stress reaction. Soldiers saw things in war, especially soldiers who'd been in continuous combat for months. The human mind could only take so much before it started breaking down. The bunker entrance had been marked with warning signs. Hazardous area, possible chemical contamination, do not enter. But the team came prepared with gas masks, protective suits, and detection equipment. The specialized gear made them look like creatures from a science fiction story as they descended into the darkness, portable lamps cutting through the shadows with harsh white light that revealed every detail the original team's flashlights had obscured. Dr. Sarah Chun, one of the chemical warfare specialists, immediately began taking air samples. Her portable spectrometer analyzed the atmosphere, checking for known toxins, nerve agents, and hallucinogens. The readings confused her. "Captain, I'm picking up trace amounts of several compounds, but nothing at concentrations that should cause hallucinations or neurological effects." Aldrich nodded. "Keep sampling. Could be localized pockets of higher concentration." The translator, Lieutenant Hans Weber, a German-American from Milwaukee, was examining the paperwork that Harrison's team had found. His face grew pale as he worked through the documents, his lips moving silently as he translated the medical terminology. "Captain, you need to see this," he said quietly. "These aren't standard military medical records. This is documentation of systematic human experimentation. The project, coded NACTANK's Night Terror, had been authorized by SS Medical Command in August 1944. The objective was to develop pharmaceutical compounds that could induce extreme psychological fear states in enemy combatants, creating a terror weapon that would break morale without conventional military engagement. The logic was grotesquely simple. Soldiers who couldn't overcome their primal fear response would be combat ineffective, and fear was contagious. Panic would spread through entire units. The test subjects were Soviet prisoners, Polish resistance fighters, and political prisoners deemed expendable by the Nazi regime. The experimental protocol was brutal in its methodology. Subjects were isolated in sensory deprivation chambers for extended periods, sometimes days, before being administered various chemical compounds. Some were derivatives of ergot alkaloids, similar to what would later become LSD. Others were synthetic compounds whose formulas were documented in the files, molecules that wouldn't be discovered by Western science for decades. Dr. Mitchell Ross, the military psychologist, read through behavioral observation logs with growing horror. They weren't just studying fear, he said. They were trying to find the breaking point of human consciousness, the exact threshold where sanity collapses into something else. The later experiments had added sensory torture, subsonic frequencies, strobe lighting, recorded sounds of screaming and violence played at random intervals. The combination of chemicals and psychological torture produced results that the German doctors had documented with cold precision. Subject 023, identified only as Victor K., Soviet partisan, age 24, had lasted 6 days before experiencing what the report called complete perceptual dissociation. The description that followed was clinical but chilling. Subject no longer responds to external stimuli. EEG readings show unusual patterns not previously documented. Subject appears conscious but does not interact with physical environment. Vocalization suggests subject perceives and responds to entities not visible to observers. Similar outcomes were documented for dozens of test subjects. The Germans had achieved their goal of inducing extreme fear states, but they'd also stumbled onto something they hadn't anticipated. The subjects weren't just hallucinating. They were, according to the increasingly frantic notes in the later documents, experiencing dimensional perception outside normal human range. Dr. Reinhardt, the lead researcher, had written in his final report, "We have opened a door that cannot be closed. Recommend immediate project termination and facility abandonment." The intelligence team photographed every document, collected samples from the medical waste, and carefully avoided touching anything more than necessary. But as they worked deeper in the bunker, Captain Aldrich began to notice what the original team had reported: the strange acoustic properties, the sense that the space was larger than it should be, and most disturbing of all, the occasional whisper sound that might have been voices or might have been air moving through ventilation shafts. He told himself it was the latter, but he wasn't entirely convinced. The deepest section of the bunker complex contained a series of 6 reinforced doors, each marked with hazard symbols and German text warning of extreme danger. Lieutenant Weber translated the warnings. High-risk area. Authorized personnel only. Subjects must remain contained at all times. The doors were made of heavy steel, each with small observation windows made of thick glass reinforced with wire mesh. 5 of the doors stood open, their interior locks broken from the inside. Captain Aldrich peered through the window of one of the open doors into a cell beyond. The chamber was small, perhaps 8 by 10 feet, with padded walls that had been torn to shreds. The padding material hung in strips, and beneath it, the concrete walls showed the same frantic scratch marks they'd seen elsewhere, but more extensive, covering every surface from floor to ceiling. In the center of the room sat a chair with leather restraints, one of which had been torn completely away from its mounting bolt. Subject 042 read the placard beside the door. Dr. Ross found the corresponding file in the medical station records. The subject had been a Ukrainian partisan fighter, captured in October 1944. Age 28, physically healthy, no prior history of mental illness. He'd been subjected to 14 consecutive sessions of compound THR, 7 combined with extended sensory deprivation. The observation notes from his final session made for disturbing reading. Day 12. Subject exhibits severe paranoid delusions, claiming to see entities in his cell. states repeatedly that they are waiting in the spaces between. Physical examination shows extreme stress markers, elevated cortisol, tachycardia, mydriasis. Subject has not slept in 72 hours despite sedatives. Day 13. Subject has become violent, requiring for orderlies to restrain. Strength appears enhanced beyond normal parameters. Subject broke Feldwebel-Schultz's wrist during struggle. Claims the entities have promised him freedom if he lets them through. Day 14. Containment breach at 3:47. Subject somehow freed himself from restraints and damaged door locking mechanism. Security detail reports subject was found in corridor, unresponsive, standing motionless. When approached, subject spoke in Russian, German, and unidentified language. Voice characteristics inconsistent with subject's normal speech patterns. That was the last entry for subject 042. The file indicated the subject had been moved to maximum security containment. Cell 6, the only door that remained closed and locked. Dr. Chen's detection equipment was picking up unusual readings near that final cell. Captain, I'm getting strange electromagnetic fluctuations coming from behind that door. Frequencies I can't identify. Aldrich approached the closed door cautiously. Unlike the others, this one showed no signs of forced entry. The locks were still engaged, the hinges intact. But the small observation window had been covered from the inside with what appeared to be dried blood, applied in deliberately random smears that completely obscured any view of the interior. We need to open it, Aldrich decided. Could be evidence inside that explains what happened here. His team exchanged nervous glances. The combat photographer, Specialist Tom Mackenzie, raised his camera and focused on the door. Sir, before we do that, I think you should see this. He gestured to his viewfinder. Aldrich looked at the camera lens and saw what Mackenzie had noticed. Shadows visible through the blood-smeared window. Shadows that moved despite no light source inside the cell. Weber found a manual release mechanism for the cell door, a crank wheel that would retract the bolt locks. On your order, sir, he said, his hand on the wheel. Aldrich checked his gas mask seal, made sure his sidearm was readily accessible, and nodded. The wheel turned with difficulty, metal grinding against metal. The bolts retracted one by one with heavy clunks that echoed through the bunker. Finally, the door swung open on protesting hinges, revealing the cell interior. Empty. The cell was completely empty except for a chair identical to those in the other cells, its restraints still intact. But the walls told a different story. Words had been scratched into the concrete in dozens of languages. English, German, Russian, Polish, and others none of them could identify. They covered every available surface in neat, orderly rows, as if written by someone with infinite patience. Weber began translating the German phrases. They are here. They have always been here. They wait in the dark places. We open the door. We let them through. The temperature in the bunker suddenly dropped, their breath becoming visible even through the gas masks. Dr. Chen's equipment began registering wild fluctuations. Captain, we need to leave now, she said urgently. These readings don't make sense. It's like there's a massive energy discharge happening, but I can't find a source. That's when they heard it. The same screaming that had driven out the first team, but louder now, closer, coming from all around them. And underneath the screams, a deeper sound, laughter. Captain Aldrich's report to Army Intelligence Command was filed under Special Classification, Restricted Access, and buried in military archives where it would remain for decades. But the story didn't end there. As Allied forces continued their push into Germany in early 1945, other units began reporting similar encounters with abandoned bunkers and underground facilities. Each report described variations on the same theme. Sealed structures, evidence of human experimentation, and inexplicable phenomena that defied rational explanation. In March 1945, British forces clearing the Harz Mountains discovered a partially collapsed bunker complex that had been marked with the same SS Medical Corps insignia found at the original site. The British soldiers reported hearing voices speaking English with various accents, Yorkshire, London, Scottish, all begging for help from within the rubble. When engineers cleared the entrance enough to investigate, they found no one alive, Only fragments of documents suggesting this facility had been part of the same Naktangs project. A pattern was emerging that deeply troubled military intelligence analysts. Dr. Sarah Chun, after recovering from her experience in the bunker, began compiling reports from various units. She discovered at least 8 separate facilities scattered across Germany and occupied Poland, all connected to Project Naktangs, all sealed under similar circumstances between November 1944 and January 1945. The timeline suggested a coordinated shutdown, as if someone in the SS Medical Command had realized that all the facilities were experiencing the same containment problem simultaneously. What Dr. Chen found most disturbing was that the German documentation showed awareness of the problem, but no understanding of what they'd actually created. Dr. Reinhardt, who appeared as the lead researcher in multiple facility reports, had written increasingly frantic memos to his superiors requesting permission to terminate the entire project. His final communication, dated December 3, 1944, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic desperation. The experimental protocols have produced results beyond our theoretical framework. The test subjects are exhibiting behaviors and perceptual capabilities that suggest we have not merely chemically altered their brain function, but fundamentally changed their interaction with reality itself. The memo continued with details that seemed to cross from hard science into something approaching occultism. Subjects in isolation report consistent descriptions of entities they claim to perceive. These descriptions match across different facilities, despite no communication between test groups. More troubling, electromagnetic monitoring equipment shows anomalous readings during subject episodes. We are not simply studying psychological terror. We may have opened channels to states or dimensions of existence previously unknown to human experience. Recommend immediate project termination and facility sterilization. Dr. Mitchell Ross, the military psychologist who'd accompanied Captain Aldrich, became obsessed with understanding what had happened. He conducted extensive research into sensory deprivation, hallucinogenic compounds, and the limits of human perception. His classified paper, The Naktangs Phenomenon, When Experimental Psychology Crosses Dimensional Boundaries, proposed a controversial theory. The Nazi experiments had accidentally discovered that human consciousness, when pushed to extreme states through chemical and psychological torture, could perceive aspects of reality normally filtered out by the brain's evolved perceptual systems. The human brain is a reducing valve, Ross wrote, borrowing from the philosopher Aldous Huxley. Evolution has shaped our consciousness to perceive only what's necessary for survival. But what if there are other levels of reality, other dimensions of existence, that surround us constantly but remain invisible because our brains have learned to edit them out? The Naktangs experiments may have chemically disabled that reducing valve, forcing subjects to perceive things that human consciousness isn't meant to experience. This theory didn't explain everything, though. It didn't explain the physical manifestations, the voices heard by people who'd never been exposed to the compounds, the figures seen in photographs, the way the bunkers themselves seemed to warp space and time around them. Something had happened in those facilities, something that left a permanent mark on reality. The test subjects hadn't just experienced hallucinations. They'd become doorways to something else, something that remained active even after their deaths. By May 1945, as the war in Europe ended, the Office of Strategic Services had collected enough information about Project Naktangs to warrant a dedicated investigation team. But that team would never get the chance to complete its work. The facilities were in territories being divided between American, British, and Soviet occupation zones, and the growing tensions that would become the Cold War meant full cooperation was impossible. Some facilities fell under Soviet control, and their fate remains unknown to this day. The Soviets never shared their findings, if they made any at all. The Americans sealed the facilities they controlled, filling some with concrete, collapsing others with controlled demolitions. Official reports cited hazardous materials contamination as the reason, but the soldiers who performed the demolition work spoke quietly among themselves of strange experiences. Shadows that moved against the light, voices heard inside the condemned structures, the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Most dismiss these stories as legend building, the kind of spooky tale soldiers have always told. But some of the men knew better, had seen too much to dismiss it all as imagination. Years after the war ended, researchers trying to understand Project Naktangs faced a significant problem. Almost no one who'd been directly involved would talk about it. The German doctors and scientists who'd run the experiments were either dead, disappeared into post-war anonymity, or protected by Operation Paperclip and similar programs that recruited Nazi scientists for Western intelligence services. The test subjects, those who'd survived, were scattered across the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, behind the Iron Curtain and out of reach. But in 1952, a breakthrough came. A Polish resistance fighter named Jerzy Kowalski contacted the U.S. Embassy in Paris claiming he'd been a prisoner at one of the Naktank facilities. He'd survived the experiments and escaped during the chaos of the facility's abandonment in November 1944. Now, 7 years later, he wanted to tell his story. The CIA sent Dr. Mitchell Ross, who'd maintained his interest in the case even after leaving military service, to interview him. Kowalski was 34 years old, but looked a decade older. His hair had gone completely white. His hands trembled constantly, and his eyes held a haunted quality that Ross had seen before in severely traumatized patients. The interview took place in a safe house outside Paris, recorded on reel-to-reel tape that still exists in classified archives. The transcript makes for difficult reading. "They gave us injections," Kowalski began, speaking slowly in heavily accented English. "Not every day, but often enough. After the injections, they would put us in the dark rooms. No light, no sound, nothing. Just darkness and whatever was in your head." At first, Kowalski explained, the darkness was terrifying but manageable. He would count, recite prayers, sing songs in his head. Anything to maintain his sense of self. But after several sessions, the darkness began to change. "It started to have texture," he said, struggling to find the right words. "Like the darkness was a thing you could touch, that could touch you back. And then I started to see them, the shapes in the darkness. At first, I thought I was going crazy, that the drugs were making me hallucinate, but they were too real, too consistent. The shapes, according to Kowalski, were humanoid but wrong somehow. Their proportions slightly off, their movements not quite natural. They didn't walk so much as glide, and they watched him with what he described as hungry interest. The German doctors had monitored his reactions, taking notes, asking questions. Did the shape speak? What did they want? Could he communicate with them? Kowalski had resisted answering at first, afraid that acknowledging the shapes would make him truly insane. But as the experiments continued, something changed. The shapes began to seem more real than the doctors, more present than the concrete walls of his cell. "They told me things," Kowalski said, whispered to me in Polish, in German, in languages I didn't know but somehow understood. They said they'd been waiting a long time. They said the darkness was their home, and we'd finally figure out how to open the door between their world and ours. They promised me freedom if I would let them through. Ross leaned forward. "Let them through? What does that mean?" Kowalski's hand shook harder. "I don't know exactly. They wanted permission, I think, an invitation, like vampires in the old stories. They can't enter unless invited. I wouldn't give it to them, but others did. I heard them at night, the other prisoners, talking to the things in their cells. And those prisoners changed. Their voices became different. When you saw them in the exercise yard, they moved wrong, looked at you wrong. The final days of the facility had been chaos," Kowalski recalled. The researchers had realized they'd lost control. Subjects who'd accepted the invitation from the shapes in the darkness had become dangerous, violent, unpredictable, impossibly strong. The Germans had tried to contain them, but the reinforced cells hadn't been enough. The ones who let them through could do things, Kowalski said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Walk through locked doors, disappear from secure rooms, be in two places at once. And their eyes, God, their eyes were empty. Whatever looked out from those eyes wasn't human anymore. The facility had been evacuated and sealed, the remaining subjects locked inside. Kowalski had escaped during the chaos, fleeing into the Polish countryside where he'd hidden among friendly villagers until the Soviets arrived. He'd never told anyone his full story until now, afraid of being dismissed as mad or worse, being recaptured by those interested in continuing the experiments. They're still there, he concluded, the things from the darkness. They found a doorway through the people who invited them, And even though those people are dead now, the doorway remains open. Those bunkers are wounds in reality, Dr. Ross. And wounds can fester. In 1963, nearly 2 decades after the war's end, a CIA analyst named Robert Hayes discovered something unusual while reviewing declassified OSS files. Hidden among routine intelligence reports from 1945 was a memorandum marked Eyes Only Project Nactanks, No Further Distribution. The memo had been written by a Colonel William Bradford, attached to Army Intelligence Command, and was dated June 12, 1945, more than a month after V-Day. Bradford's memo detailed a discovery made by advancing American forces in Thuringia, a villa outside Erfurt that had served as the central administrative headquarters for Project Nactanks. Unlike the experimental facilities, which had been bunkers and underground complexes, this building had been a requisition the state used for record-keeping and planning. The German personnel had abandoned it so hastily that they'd left filing cabinets full of documentation, project proposals, experimental protocols, budget allocations, and most importantly, progress reports from all 8 known facilities. What Hayes found most intriguing was Bradford's description of one particular document, a final report from Dr. Ernst Reinhardt dated January 15, 1945. Reinhardt had survived the war, according to Bradford's intelligence, and had been captured by American forces in Bavaria. He'd been cooperative, apparently relieved to be in custody, and had provided extensive debriefing about Project Nactanks. His testimony was classified at the highest level, and Bradford's memo was frustratingly vague about details, referring instead to attached documentation that Hayes couldn't locate in the archives. Hayes spent months tracking down the missing files through the labyrinthine classification system. He finally found them in a separate archive under a different project name, Operation Threshold. The 50-page report from Dr. Reinhardt was disturbing in its clinical detail. The German doctor had approached the project with scientific rigor, carefully documenting not just what happened, but his evolving understanding of why it happened, and that evolution led conclusions that challenged every assumption of materialist science. The compounds we developed were designed to suppress the brain's filtering mechanisms, Reinhardt had written. The human nervous system is constantly bombarded with sensory data, far more than conscious awareness can process. The brain has evolved sophisticated systems to filter out irrelevant information, allowing us to focus on what's important for survival. Our compounds temporarily disable these filters, forcing subjects to perceive the full spectrum of sensory input without the brain's protective editing. The results, Reinhardt explained, were initially consistent with expectations. Subjects experienced sensory overload, synesthesia, and hallucinations as their brains struggled to process unfiltered input. But something unexpected happened with prolonged exposure. Subjects began reporting consistent perceptions that couldn't be explained as mere hallucinations. Multiple subjects in isolated facilities, with no communication between them, describe identical entities, the shapes in the darkness that Kowalski had mentioned in his interview. At first, I attributed this to common archetypal imagery from the human unconscious, Reinhardt wrote. Jung's shadow figures, manifestations of primal fear. But the consistency was too exact. Subject described not just similar types of entities, but identical individuals with distinguishing characteristics. Moreover, these entities demonstrated knowledge of things the subjects couldn't possibly know, personal details about other prisoners, events occurring in distant parts of the facility, information about the experimental protocols themselves. Reinhardt had conducted an experiment to test his growing suspicion. He'd shown photographs of people unknown to a test subject, mixed among photographs of facility staff the subject had seen. The entities the subject described perceiving had correctly identified which people in the photographs worked at the facility, despite the subject having no normal means of acquiring this information. This was not hallucination, Reinhardt concluded. The subjects were perceiving something real, something that existed independent of their minds. The doctor's final conclusion was stark. Human consciousness is not a product of brain, but rather something the brain filters and constrains. By removing these constraints, we have allowed subjects to perceive other levels of reality, other dimensions of existence that interpenetrate our own. Moreover, we have attracted the attention of conscious entities that inhabit these adjacent realities. These entities have demonstrated intent and purpose. Specifically, a desire to manifest more fully in our dimension of reality. They require human consciousness as a bridge or gateway to achieve this manifestation. Reinhardt had recommended not just termination of the project, but complete destruction of all facilities and elimination of all subjects, for security of human reality itself, as he put it. His superiors had ignored the recommendation, sealed the facilities, and fled as the Allied forces approached. The subject had been left locked inside with whatever they'd invited into our world. Hayes found an addendum to report that chilled him, a note from Colonel Bradford indicating that Reinhardt had committed suicide 3 days after completing his debriefing, leaving behind a message that simply read, "They follow me out." In 1978, a German paranormal research team from the University of Freiburg received permission to investigate the sealed bunker complex that Lieutenant Harrison had first encountered in 1945. The site was in East Germany, but Dayton had opened possibilities for limited scientific cooperation. The team consisted of Dr. Klaus Bergmann, a psychologist specializing in anomalous perception, Dr. Ilse Werner, a physicist interested in electromagnetic anomalies, and Hans Muller, a photographer and equipment technician. The East German authorities allowed them 3 days of access under military supervision. The bunker entrance had been sealed with concrete after the war, but time and weather had created cracks large enough to permit entry with proper equipment. Dr. Bergmann's expedition notes, later published in a fringe academic journal, describe what they found. The interior remains largely as described in the 1945 American military reports. Physical evidence of the medical experiments is still present. Examination tables, restraint equipment, shattered chemical containers. But the most striking feature is the pervading sense of wrongness that intensifies as one penetrates deeper into the complex. Dr. Werner set up electromagnetic monitoring equipment throughout the bunker. Her instruments immediately registered anomalies, fluctuating magnetic fields with no apparent source, radio frequency interference that formed patterns almost resembling speech, and temperature variations that didn't correspond to any normal environmental factors. "We are detecting energy manifestations inconsistent with known physical processes," she noted in her log. "Recommend extended monitoring period to collect adequate data." On the second night, with the team sleeping in a tent outside the bunker, Muller was awakened by his cameras activating inside the complex. Time-lapse equipment set to record any movement or light changes. When he reviewed the film later, he found something that should have been impossible. The cameras, positioned to cover the main corridor and several of the experimental cells, had captured figures moving through the bunker, indistinct humanoid shapes that appeared and disappeared without entering or leaving the frame, as if materializing from and dematerializing back into the darkness. More disturbing was when Muller enhanced the images. The figures weren't walking on the floor but hovering several inches above it, and their movements had a stuttering quality, as if they were appearing in discrete positions rather than moving smoothly through space. Dr. Bergmann attempted to enter the bunker that night to investigate, but was stopped by the East German military liaison, who reported hearing disturbances from inside and refused to permit further night operations. The third day brought the most significant incident. Dr. Werner placed herself in one of the former containment cells to take readings with handheld equipment, while Bergmann monitored from outside. After 15 minutes, her radio transmissions became erratic. "I'm seeing there are shapes moving along the walls. They're not shadows. They have mass, substance. One of them is looking at me. Oh God, it's asking me something. It wants to know if the transmission cut off." Bergmann and Muller rushed into the bunker to find Dr. Werner unconscious on the floor of the cell, her equipment scattered around her. Her vital signs were normal, but she remained unresponsive for nearly an hour. When she finally regained consciousness, she had no memory of what had happened after entering the cell, but her equipment had recorded everything. Audio files filled with whispered voices speaking in multiple languages, video showing shadows coalescing into almost human forms, and electromagnetic readings that spiked to impossible levels during the incident. The East German authorities terminated the investigation immediately, citing safety concerns. The team's findings were confiscated, though Muller had secretly made copies of his photographs. Dr. Werner never spoke publicly about her experience, but colleagues noted she developed severe anxiety and avoided enclosed spaces for the rest of her life. Bergman attempted to return to the site in 1982, but was denied access. The bunker was sealed again, this time with steel plates and concrete reinforced with rebar, and the surrounding area was declared a restricted military zone. Other investigations over the years met similar fates. In 1985, a French documentary crew attempting to explore one of the sealed facilities in the former French occupation zone was turned away by local authorities who cited structural instability. In 1991, after German reunification, several of the bunkers were scheduled for demolition as part of clearing former military sites. Construction crews reported equipment malfunctions, unexplained accidents, and workers refusing to enter certain structures after experiencing psychological distress. The demolition projects were quietly abandoned, the sites left sealed and forgotten. By the 1990s, a small community of researchers had compiled enough data about the Naktang's facilities to propose theories about what had actually occurred. Dr. Thomas Weiland, a physicist at Cambridge who became interested in the case after reading declassified intelligence reports, published a controversial paper titled Consciousness as Dimensional Interface, the Naktang's Evidence. His theory attempted to bridge quantum physics, neuroscience, and the documented paranormal phenomena into a coherent framework. Weiland proposed that human consciousness exists simultaneously in multiple dimensional states, but evolution has constrained our awareness to perceive only 3 spatial dimensions plus time. The brain acts as a dimensional filter, he wrote, reducing the full spectrum of reality to a manageable subset that serves survival. This filtering is not passive, but requires active neurochemical processes. Disrupt those processes, and the filter fails. The Nazi experiments had done exactly that. Use chemical compounds and psychological torture to disable the brain's filtering mechanisms. But Weiland's theory went further. He suggested that other dimensions are not empty, but inhabited by forms of consciousness that have evolved in different dimensional contexts. These entities normally cannot interact with our 3-dimensional reality because they exist in states we cannot perceive and cannot perceive us in return. The Naktang subjects became bridges, Weiland explained. Their altered consciousness allowed them to perceive these other entities, but crucially, it also allowed the entities to perceive and interact with them. A 2-way channel was established. The theory addressed one of the most puzzling aspects of the phenomena: why the effects persisted long after the subjects died and the facilities were abandoned. Weiland proposed that consciousness, in its multidimensional state, doesn't simply cease at death, but rather redistributes across dimensional boundaries. The Naktang subjects, having established connections to other dimensional states while alive, may become permanently anchored to both our reality and the others they perceived. They exist in a liminal state, Weiland wrote, caught between dimensions, unable to fully transition to either. The bunkers themselves became focal points for this dimensional bleeding. Critics attacked the theory from multiple angles. Mainstream physicists dismissed it as pseudoscience, noting it made predictions that couldn't be tested. Neuroscientists argued that altered states of consciousness, no matter how extreme, couldn't literally open doorways to other dimensions. But Weiland pointed to the physical evidence, the electromagnetic anomalies, the photographic documentation, the consistent reports across multiple facilities, and multiple decades from trained observers who had no reason to fabricate their accounts. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a neuroscientist at MIT, offered a competing theory that attempted to explain the phenomena without invoking multiple dimensions. She proposed that the Nazi compounds had created a form of persistent neurological contamination, molecules that remained active in the environment and affected anyone who entered the bunkers, causing similar hallucinations across time. We're dealing with a chemical agent that induces specific, reproducible perceptual states, she argued. The consistency of reports doesn't indicate objective reality, but rather consistent neurological effects. However, Martinez's theory struggled to explain certain details: the voices speaking languages that visitors didn't know, the entities that appeared in photographs but not to the naked eye, the physical effects like equipment malfunctions and temperature changes that occurred independent of human perception. Weiland and Martinez debated these points in academic journals, neither fully convincing the other, both acknowledging that significant mysteries remained. A third perspective came from Dr. Robert Hayes, the CIA analyst who'd first compiled the Project Naktang's documentation. Now retired and free to speak more openly, Hayes suggested that both theories might be partially correct. What if consciousness itself is the bridge between dimensions? He proposed in a 1996 interview. Not because consciousness is magical or supernatural, but because it's a quantum process that operates across dimensional boundaries by its very nature. The Nazis didn't discover something new. They rediscovered something ancient that humans have always known, but forgotten. Shamans, mystics, people who claim to see spirits or other realms. Maybe they were accessing the same states through different means. Hayes noted that many cultures had traditions of altered consciousness used to perceive other realities. Ayahuasca ceremonies in South America, peyote rituals among Native Americans, meditation practices in Buddhism. The difference is that those traditions developed protocols, safeguards, trained practitioners who understood they were working with dangerous forces. The Nazis had none of that. They were amateurs playing with fire, and they got burned. Worse, they left the fire burning in those bunkers, and it's still there waiting. The academic debate continued. But without access to the sealed facilities for controlled research, no theory could be definitively proven. The bunkers remained off-limits. The phenomena unexplained, and the mystery deepened with each failed attempt at investigation. Yet researchers kept trying, drawn by the tantalizing possibility that the Nactang's facilities might hold evidence of realms beyond our normal perception, or evidence that human consciousness was far stranger and more powerful than mainstream science acknowledged. Not everyone who entered the sealed bunkers died or went mad. Over the decades, a handful of individuals who had close encounters with the phenomena came forward to share their experiences, providing a human dimension to the academic theories and classified reports. Their testimonies, collected by researchers and journalists, painted a disturbing picture of what it meant to glimpse the reality behind the sealed doors. James Harrison, the lieutenant who led the first investigation in 1945, lived until 1987. In his final years, suffering from terminal cancer, he gave an extensive interview to a military historian researching the European campaign. Harrison spoke at length about the bunker, something he'd avoided for decades. "People think I'm senile now, so I might as well tell the truth," he said, his voice weak but determined. "We heard screaming, yes, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was understanding, somehow, what those screams meant." Harrison explained that as he'd stood in the bunker listening to the cacophony of agonized voices, he'd experienced a moment of terrible clarity. "I understood them, not the words. They were speaking languages I didn't know. But I understood their meaning, their desperation. They were trapped, caught in some kind of existence that was neither life nor death. They were aware, conscious, but without bodies, without the ability to affect the physical world except through sound. They'd been screaming for months, maybe longer, and they continue screaming forever because there was no way out for them." The realization had filled Harrison with profound horror and profound pity. Some of them were the test subjects, the prisoners the Nazis had tortured. But others were the torturers themselves, the doctors, the guards, the SS officers who'd run the experiments. They were all trapped together in that liminal space, victims and perpetrators alike, experiencing an eternity of suffering they created. And the worst part of me understood that I could end up there too, that anyone who got too close to that place risked being pulled in. Sergeant Michael Kovacs, who'd been with Harrison that day, confirmed these details in his own interview years earlier. Kovacs had developed severe PTSD after the war, but he'd always insisted the bunker incident was different from ordinary combat trauma. In battle, you see terrible things, but you can process them because they make sense in context. War is hell. People die. You move on. But the bunker, that didn't make sense in any context. It violated fundamental assumptions about reality, about life and death, about what's possible. How do you process that? Dr. Ilse Werner, the physicist who'd lost consciousness in the bunker during the 1978 investigation, finally broke her silence in a 2003 interview shortly before her death. She'd spent 25 years trying to forget what had happened, but the memories had only grown stronger with time. "I didn't just see the entities," she revealed. "I communicated with them, or they communicated with me. Not in words, but in direct transfer of information, experience, emotion. I felt what they felt, the agony of being trapped between states of existence, the hunger for physical manifestation, the desperate longing for someone to open the door and let them through. Werner described the entities as profoundly alien yet recognizably conscious. They weren't demons or ghosts in any traditional sense. They were beings that existed in dimensional states we can barely conceive of, and they become aware of our reality because the Nazi experiments had created a temporary bridge. Some of the test subjects, in their altered states, had essentially invited these entities to use their consciousness as a gateway. When the subjects died, the gateway should have closed, but instead, it remained partially open, a wound in the fabric of reality. The entities had made Werner an offer. She admitted they'd promised her knowledge, understanding of physics and reality far beyond human science. All she had to do was consent, allow them to use her consciousness as a more permanent bridge to our dimension. I was tempted, Werner confessed. For a moment, I genuinely considered accepting. The knowledge they offered was everything I devoted my life to understanding. But then I felt something else, a warning, maybe from my own survival instinct or maybe from the remnants of the test subject's consciousness still trapped there. I understood that if I said yes, I wouldn't really gain knowledge. I'd become a doorway, and everything that I was would be consumed in the process. Werner had refused, and that's when she'd lost consciousness. She'd woken with no memory of the incident. But over the years, fragments had returned in dreams and flashes of unwanted recall. "I'm dying now," she said in her final interview. "Cancer, like Lieutenant Harrison. And I'm afraid, not of death itself, but of what comes after. Because I know now that consciousness doesn't simply end. It transitions, transforms, moves to other states. And I'm terrified that when I die, I'll find myself in that same liminal space, trapped with all the others who got too close to the wounds in reality. That's the real horror of the Naktangs Project. They didn't just torture and kill people. They damaged the very structure of existence, creating spaces where consciousness can become trapped forever. In 2015, a German construction company received permits to redevelop a forested area outside Göttingen that had once been a military training ground. The site had been abandoned since the 1950s, and environmental surveys found no significant contamination. Construction began in March, crews clearing trees and excavating for foundations. In June, they discovered something that halted all work, an underground bunker complex that appeared on no historical records or military maps. The local authorities contacted the federal government, which dispatched historians and military archaeologists. Dr. Anna Richter, leading the investigation team, recognized the architectural features immediately. The reinforced instruction, the specialized ventilation systems, the layout of containment cells. "This is a Naktangs facility," she reported, her voice tight with apprehension. "Possibly the main one, the central research hub. It's been hidden here for 70 years, completely off the books." The bunker was larger than any of the previously discovered facilities, with 3 underground levels and extensive laboratory spaces. Initial exploration revealed a treasure trove of documentation that had somehow survived decades of abandonment. Filing cabinets full of experimental data, personal journals from researchers, even film reels documenting the experiments. For historians and scientists, it was an unprecedented find. For those who understood the Naktangs phenomena, it was something else, a potential catastrophe. The documentation revealed that this facility, designated Site 0, had been Dr. Reinhardt's primary research location. The experiments conducted here were more extensive and more extreme than those at the satellite facilities. The test subject count was in the hundreds, and the experimental protocols had pushed far beyond pharmaceutical compounds into areas that blurred the line between science and occultism. Reinhardt's later journals, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, described attempts to create what he called stable dimensional interfaces, human subjects who could maintain contact with other realities without losing their sanity or dying. "We have achieved partial success," one entry read. Subject 173 has maintained stability for 47 days while reporting continuous contact with entities from adjacent dimensional states. She describes them with remarkable consistency and claims they are teaching her to strengthen the connection. "We are documenting everything, though I confess growing unease about the ultimate implications of this research." Subject 173 insists the entities are benevolent, but her description of their true nature is disturbing. The final entries in Reinhardt's journal, dated November 1944, described a catastrophic loss of control. Multiple subjects who'd achieved stable interfaces had apparently coordinated an escape attempt, but not a physical escape. Something else. They are trying to bring the entities through. Reinhardt had written in obvious panic. All of them working together, attempting to create a permanent gateway. We've initiated emergency containment protocols, but I fear we're too late. The dimensional boundaries in this facility have been fundamentally compromised. Recommendation: immediate evacuation and sealing of entire complex. This knowledge must be buried, destroyed, forgotten. We have committed an unforgivable sin against reality itself. Dr. Richter's team worked quickly to document everything before sealing the facility again, but they noticed problems from the beginning. Equipment malfunctions were constant. Cameras failing, recording devices producing corrupted files, lights flickering and dying. Several team members reported severe headaches and disorientation. One researcher, Dr. Marcus Klein, collapsed while examining the lowest level and was evacuated to a hospital, where he remained in a catatonic state for 3 days before suddenly recovering with no memory of the incident. The most disturbing discovery came when they reached the deepest chamber, a circular room at the bottom of level 3. Unlike the rest of the bunker, this room showed no signs of abandonment or decay. It was pristine, as if time hadn't touched it. In the center stood a chair, not a restraint chair like those found elsewhere, but an ornate seat carved from dark wood, almost throne-like, and occupying the chair was a figure. At first, they thought it was a corpse, remarkably preserved by the cool, dry environment. But as they approached with lights and cameras, the figure's eyes opened. The team froze, unable to process what they were seeing. The woman in the chair, because it was clearly female despite the withered condition of the body, was alive, or something like alive. Her eyes tracked their movements. Her lips moved as if trying to speak, but no sound emerged except a low, continuous vibration that made their bones ache. Dr. Richter ordered an immediate evacuation. As the team retreated toward the surface, they heard it, the same screaming that had been reported in 1945, in 1978, and in every subsequent investigation. But this time, underneath the screams, they heard something else. Laughter and singing, and voices speaking in languages that had never existed in human history. The facility was sealed 3 days later using concrete, steel, and specialized materials designed to block electromagnetic radiation. The construction permit was revoked. The land designated as a nature preserve with public access prohibited indefinitely. Official records listed the site as containing hazardous unexploded ordnance from World War II. 75 years after Sergeant Kovacs first heard screams emanating from a sealed bunker in the frozen forests of Germany, the mystery of Project Nactanks remains unsolved. The facilities that once housed horrific experiments now stand as monuments to humanity's capacity for cruelty and our dangerous curiosity about the boundaries of consciousness and reality. But they are more than historical artifacts. They are active wounds in the fabric of existence, places where the normal rules break down and something else bleeds through. The documented evidence is extensive and troubling. Military reports, scientific studies, eyewitness testimonies, photographic and audio recordings, all pointing toward phenomena that challenge our understanding of what's possible. Skeptics attribute everything to psychological factors, environmental contamination, or simple fraud. But the sheer volume and consistency of reports, spanning decades and coming from credible observers with no apparent motive to deceive, make dismissal difficult. Something happened in those bunkers, something that continues to happen. Modern theoretical physics has developed concepts that might explain aspects of the Nactanks phenomena. Quantum mechanics suggests reality is far stranger than our everyday experience indicates. Particles existing in multiple states simultaneously, instantaneous connections across vast distances, observer effects that blur the line between consciousness and physical reality. String theory proposes additional dimensions beyond the four we perceive. Multiverse theory suggests infinite parallel realities, existing alongside our own. Perhaps the Nazi experiments accidentally stumbled onto practical applications of these exotic physics. creating temporary bridges to other dimensional states or parallel realities. But even if we accept such explanations, profound questions remain. If the test subjects did perceive other dimensions or realities, what exactly did they encounter there? Were the entities they described real beings with independent existence, or projections of human consciousness encountering unfamiliar states? If the entities are real, what are their intentions toward our reality? And most disturbing, are the bunkers still serving as gateways, with something slowly leaking through into our world? Some researchers have noted an unsettling pattern. In areas surrounding the known Nactangs facilities, there have been elevated reports of unusual phenomena over the decades. Unexplained sounds, electronic disturbances, clusters of psychological distress cases, even disappearances that remain unsolved. Statistical analysis is difficult because the data is scattered and incomplete, but several studies have suggested correlations between proximity to the sealed bunkers and various anomalies. If true, it implies the effects are not contained, that the dimensional wounds are spreading slowly outward like infections spreading from untreated injuries. The human cost of Project Nactangs is impossible to fully calculate. The documented test subjects numbered in the hundreds, but many records were destroyed or lost. These were people, resistance fighters, prisoners of war, political dissidents, people with names and families and lives that were stolen from them. They were subjected to torture disguised as science. Their consciousnesses shattered and their humanity violated in the most fundamental way possible. And if the testimonies are accurate, some part of them remains trapped in an existence worse than death, screaming in darkness that no one can penetrate. But there's another legacy, one that's harder to quantify. Project Nactangs demonstrated that human consciousness is stranger and more powerful than we typically acknowledge. Whatever the ultimate explanation for phenomena, dimensional bleeding, persistent environmental contamination, collective psychological trauma, or something else entirely, the experiments prove that consciousness can be manipulated in ways that produce extraordinary effects. That knowledge doesn't disappear just because the facilities are sealed. It's documented in classified files, academic papers, and the memories of those who've studied the case. The fear among some researchers is that Project Nactangs won't remain a historical curiosity. Advances in neuroscience, pharmacology, and physics are providing new tools to explore consciousness and reality. Military and intelligence agencies around the world continue to investigate the potential applications of altered states, remote viewing programs, enhanced interrogation techniques, cognitive enhancement research. What happens when modern technology meets the knowledge preserved from the Nazi experiments? Will we repeat their mistakes, opening doors that should remain closed? Lieutenant Harrison, in his final interview, offered a warning that resonates today. We like to think we're rational, scientific, in control of nature and reality, but the bunker taught me we're not. We're children play with forces we don't understand, and sometimes we break things we can't fix. Those screams we heard, they're still there, still going on, because we opened something that can't be closed. Future generations need to learn from that. Some doors shouldn't be open, no matter how curious we are about what's on the other side. Because once they're open, you can't unhear the screaming. The wounds of war run deeper than the scars on the land or the names on memorials. They cut into the fabric of reality itself, leaving marks that echo across generations. Project Nactangs was one such wound, a convergence of human cruelty, scientific hubris, and cosmic horror that created something that defies easy explanation. The sealed bunkers remain, scattered across Europe, monuments to experiments that push beyond the boundaries of ethical science into realms that challenge our understanding of consciousness, reality, and the thin line between the two. If this story has pulled you into shadows where history meets mystery, where documented military reports encounter inexplicable phenomena, then you found your home at Farida's de Guerra, Wounds of War. This channel is dedicated to exploring the dark histories of conflict, the mysteries that emerge from humanity's darkest hours, and the scars that never fully heal. We go beyond the conventional narratives to examine what war truly costs, not just in lives and resources, but in the fabric of reality itself. Subscribe to Farida's de Guerra and join us as we investigate the forgotten corners of military history, the classified experiments that went wrong, the battlefields that refused to rest silent, and the supernatural shadows that war leaves behind. From haunted trenches to secret weapons programs, from disappearances that remain unsolved to phenomena that defy rational explanation, we document the wounds of war that history prefers to forget. Hit that notification bell, because the screaming hasn't stopped, and we're going to keep listening until we understand what it means. The bunkers are sealed, but the story isn't over. Not by a long shot. Welcome to Farida's de Guerra. Some wounds never heal.